Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very unique podcast. I am joined by Ben from Laminar Research, who is going to really kind of talk our ears off today, all about X-Plane 11, and in particular, the upcoming exciting Vulkan update that I know so many people out there are really, really anticipating to finally get into their copy of X-Plane 11. So, Ben, thank you very much for joining me. And hello, and welcome to this kind of unique podcast with myself and the FSElite.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's been a very exciting and pretty crazy December for us, and we've got the Vulkan build of X-Plane in private beta now. So we're super excited to see it in the hands of third-party developers. We're starting to get some feedback about the performance. So this has been an exciting thing to see after so many years of working on it.
And as we were kind of saying just off air just now, it's also been really busy for you guys at Laminar as well. I mean, you've had the X-Plane mobile, kind of that huge update, and obviously the Vulkan stuff and Christmas. So you must be feeling pretty tired already, and it's only the beginning of the year.
That's right. It was a very busy December for us, and everybody really pushed to get these milestones out. And it's not easy because people have family and they have holidays, and we wanted to get the Vulkan beta out before the end of the year. We managed to do that for third parties. We wanted to get it out to everybody, but we realized that what we had was something that third parties could really start to look at with their add-ons. They were getting us really great bug feedback, and now we're just pushing to get the bugs fixed and get it to everybody basically as soon as we can.
So before we get into kind of like the technical details and stuff of what Vulkan is and how it's going to enhance the simulator and stuff going forward, maybe you can just give a quick rundown of little bit about yourself, what you do, and kind of your involvement with the Laminar Research team.
Sure. So we all wear a lot of different hats at Laminar Research. There's probably about a dozen and a half of us now, so it's still a very small company, and everybody takes on a lot of different kinds of work, which is one of the things that's fun about being at Laminar. We get to all try lots of different things. For me, there's two big things I do. I'm the product director for X-Plane, the desktop edition. So I have responsibility for what X-Plane desktop is going to be, what kind of features we're going to put in when, and how we're going to get all those things put together and make releases. And I also do a lot of the graphics and scenery programming. I'm not the only one who does that, but a lot of the rendering engine, the lighting, some of the scenery creation, that's kind of been my main area for the last couple of years now.
So how did you, this is completely off the cuff, but how did you kind of get involved with working with Austin and kind of developing X-Plane?
It was a very weird set of coincidences and accidents. It was definitely not anything intentional. I was working for a company on the West Coast, and I lived on the East Coast, and so I was flying a lot, coast to coast, and it kind of reignited my interest in aviation from back when I was a kid. And that took me to VATSIM and online flight and air traffic control. And I started using X-Plane because I was just looking for a flight simulator, that would run well on the computers I had that I could fly online with. And I got X-Plane 6 back in the day, and it was just so smooth and it looked so good. And I was hooked. And then I said, well, I've got to fly this on VATSIM, but you couldn't do that back then. You could only fly Microsoft Flight Simulator. And I said, well, I'm a computer programmer. I can fix this. So I called up Austin and said, hey, I'm going to go attach your sim to VATSIM. And he's like, who are you? But I ended up doing add-ons for X-Plane and working with Austin a bit. And I ended up quitting my job to become an air traffic controller. And I went to one of the accredited college programs to become an air traffic controller. And I was actually on the list with the FAA to become an air traffic controller. But while this was going on, I started working for Austin part-time because while I was in school, I said, I've always wanted to do a little bit just to make X-Plane look better, and I've got some time now. Let's do this. Let's work on the scenery. And what ended up happening was the government was really, really slow to call me back about air traffic control. And Austin and I got in deeper and deeper with X-Plane and the scenery system. And by the time they called me back and said, how'd you like to push tin in Washington, D.C., I was like, we're already into X-Plane 8, and I kind of never left. So it was a circuitous route from programming to air traffic control and back to flight simulation.
So do you still have you found yourself on the VATSIM network doing any controlling just as a bit of a hobby, or have you you so neck deep in kind of work and stuff at the moment?
I have not worked as a controller in that sim in at least a decade. Every now and then I get to take a flight as a pilot. I don't think they've revoked my ID yet, but one of the side effects of working on a flight simulator is that you just don't get to do nearly as much flying as you could before. Um, every now and then I'll get to take a flight. Sometimes I'll be working on testing VR and I'll be, if I really want to test this, I better go do a couple laps just to make sure it really works.
Yeah,
The VR experience is so immersive. It's very easy to get distracted when you're trying to fix a bug and just keep on flying. Oh, what's that over there? But VATSIM is sort of where we came from. So, and actually Chris Serio as well, who also works for us now, was another VATSIM programmer. So we definitely appreciate, what online flight can be and, what you get from being in that kind of interactive environment.
for sure. I've always think it's quite interesting to see how people within our community and our industry and stuff will kind of get to where they are today, and it's never really a straightforward kind of transition, is it? From I know I'm going to be a programmer and I know I'm going to develop for this sim, so it's always kind of that roundabout way, but it's always awesome regardless of the story. And I just want to pick up on what you mentioned about you were brought on board to kind of initially do that kind of connection between X-Plane and VATSIM, and then you developed your skills into making X-Plane look better. And now I guess the next kind of move on from making X-Plane perform better is kind of this big move from the OpenGL platform over to Vulkan and Metal. So for those maybe who are a little bit less technically versed, for the people like me, could you just tell us what Vulkan is, and obviously Metal as well, as part of they kind of come hand in hand, and why it's such an important milestone for X-Plane going forward?
Sure. So we've actually struggled with this within the company to figure out how to talk about Vulkan because sometimes we have to show an error message in the sim. We could not initialize your Vulkan driver, and we're going, do they know what Vulkan is? What is this thing? How do we talk about it? Vulkan is a graphics standard for applications to talk to graphics hardware, GPUs. And Vulkan drivers are graphics drivers provided by NVIDIA and AMD that let an app that speaks Vulkan, in some air quotes, talk to their card. So in that sense, it's similar to DirectX or Direct 3D 11 or 12. It's similar to OpenGL. It's a new way to talk to your hardware. And we like Vulkan because it's really good for what we want to do. Vulkan is kind of a rethink of how a graphics driver should work with games and real-time simulations in mind. So it's really good for performance. It's really good for smooth flight. It's good for not having stutters. And it's also really good for multi-core. And this was one of the big reasons why the industry said we need to do a new driver as opposed to just trying to fix OpenGLs, because OpenGL has been around for decades, and I've been around for decades. And when I started doing flight simulation, we had one core. We had like a Pentium 4. Like that was a really great flight sim machine, and it had one core. And so multi-core, like just no one was thinking about it, because why would you want that? No one has one core. And now it's just the opposite. I mean, you can't buy a one-core machine, right? So what you need is a graphics API that is meant to be used from multi-core machines. And that's not something that you can just fix in a driver. It requires rethinking. So Vulkan does all those things for us. And what we're doing in some ways is all that and more, because we are moving X-Plane to talk to Vulkan, and we're also changing how X-Plane works to take advantage of Vulkan. So a lot of the code that I first wrote for Austin, in those early days when I just barely escaped being an air traffic controller, was designed for OpenGL, was designed for one-core machines, and we were trying to do the best with the very limited resources we could. And if we're flying and we had to load something, you were going to have a stutter. It happens. Like, it was unavoidable. You only have one core. And now we're going back and saying, well, we have these computers that can do more than one thing at the same time. We have this great driver that can run without stuttering. Let's go through our code and really take advantage of that and make sure it's going to be smooth and predictable and fast and modern. And a lot of this has been revisiting some of that very first work I did for Austin back in the day, and taking those that code I wrote, which was good for its day, and replacing it with something that's much more modern and is going to give us a much better foundation and much better performance.
So you obviously, I think it's. I mean, I've seen like read messages, I've seen Facebook posts, and I've seen kind of the community's perception of what Vulkan's going to do. And you talk a lot about performance, and I think there may be this misconception, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but Vulkan is not going to suddenly give you 100 FPS if you've been used to 30 FPS on your current machine. Is that kind of the right thinking? This is more about smooth performance. This is about a less stuttery experience, and more so than kind of that increase in frames per second.
It really depends a lot on your situation. And this is one of the things that's sort of hard to communicate, because sometimes we'll do a Vulkan blog post and it'll just be, will it make this faster? Will it make that faster? And it really depends. So we can talk about a few different cases. If your computer is slow because your GPU is underpowered and you're running a 4K res with HDR on and 8x anti-aliasing and you've got like a GeForce 680, the problem is that your GPU is not up to the task, and Vulkan is not going to help, because Vulkan helps the CPU. But if the problem is that your CPU is too slow and you've got a GeForce Titan and you've got an older machine and your CPU is just not feeding it and your GPU is bored, then Vulkan, maybe it will help your performance. We've seen big performance increases on AMD hardware because we were never able to get the OpenGL AMD driver to run as fast as we wanted. Their Vulkan driver is significantly faster, so that's been a really nice bright spot. We've seen big performance improvements on the Mac going from OpenGL to Metal. The Metal driver is a lot faster, and Metal is an API for OS X that basically does for the Mac what Vulkan does for Windows and Linux. Pretty much everything we said about it's new, it's modern, it does multi-core, it's got lower overhead, it's predictable. Basically all of that's true for Metal. And so we've done Metal and Vulkan at the same time. Our sim can run with different drivers for different platforms. That actually has not been a terribly difficult thing for us. So that allows Mac users to get the same benefits. So we've seen big performance increases there. But we have seen performance improvements even for NVIDIA users on Windows. And the NVIDIA driver was always very fast, sort of spookily so. But even then, we've heard reports of some FIPS improvement. But if you were running and you've got pretty good FIPS already, the smoothness is probably the really big feature. To take that high frame rate and keep it that way. And with Vulkan, we get so much more predictability from the driver. And we've gone through and fixed so many of our problems that we're finally seeing a point where we can get really nice, smooth flight that's locked up and doesn't stutter as you do things.
And obviously this kind of concept of smooth flight is incredibly important for the way X-Plane handles the flight dynamics. Is that right?
It does help a lot for flight dynamics. I would say it's hard to feel how good the flight dynamics are if the flight isn't smooth. I mean, Austin has always felt that, you should be running at 60 FIPS and not at 20 FIPS. And X-Plane has a bottom limit of 20 FIPS. And sometimes you should say, well, why can't I run at 15? Why can't I run at 10? And we say, you're not really feeling the flight if you're going that slow. We think that 60 is a lot better. And the faster you go, the more the smoothness matters. If you think about it, if the sim is running at 15 FIPS and a little glitch happens, it's hard to notice because everything's really slow already. But if you're running at 60, 70, 80 FIPS, almost anything that happens is noticeable if it slows you down. Think of how little of a bump you need on the highway to feel that bump when you're going at high speed. So as we've seen users flying faster, as we've improved performance, smoothness has become much more of a factor.
Like, obviously performance is obviously really important, and you've spoken a lot about kind of different types of GPUs that people could potentially have and how it may impact their experience with X-Plane 11 going forward with Vulkan. And it kind of reminds me of the blog post you put out just a few days ago talking about VRAM and how much of an impact Vulkan will have kind of to do with that. So I must admit, I read it through and I had to read it again because it got quite, not technical, but it was a lot of information to take in. So for anyone who kind of read that article and thought, not really quite too sure what impact it has for me and my current GPU, could you maybe give a little bit more information and detail about that?
Yeah, I have some buyer's remorse on that article because I tried explaining what we're doing with VRAM and I got so many comments saying, oh my God, everything's going to be blurry. I have to buy a new graphics card. And No. So we expect that Vulkan will not require more hardware than you already have. We're definitely not trying to force anybody into an update. And the VRAM story has kind of always been the same with X-Plane, which is, VRAM is memory on your graphics card where we can store textures so that the graphics card can render fast. And if you don't have enough of it, then the data has to be held somewhere else. It's going to slow down drawing. And so if you want high FIPS and a lot of detail, you need more VRAM. So if you're using more add-ons, you might need more VRAM. If you've got your texture slider set up at the max, you might need more VRAM. And if you have an older graphics card with less VRAM, maybe you turn that slider down a little bit so that you can still fly. And things are not going to be as sharp, but it's still going to work. And that's all going to be true under Vulkan. The big difference is that when VRAM gets tight with the old code, with the OpenGL driver would just try to move data around for us to try to solve the problem. And sometimes while it was doing that, we'd be stuck. We couldn't fly because the card would be like, I'm busy. I'm moving your textures. We'll do more drawing when I'm done. And that's not great because it can happen mid-flight and stutter. And what we realized with Vulkan is that this process is up to us now. One of the big differences between Vulkan and OpenGL is that Vulkan is a very thin driver that does a very small amount of stuff. And therefore, all these things that the OpenGL driver did for us, it's now part of X-Plane. So we now have great power and great responsibility because it's up to us to manage your VRAM. It's up to us to manage the card caches. And if we do a really good job, we can get great results. And if we have bugs or we screw up, we can absolutely make a hash of it. So it's not simple work. But what we can do is we can say, it would be better to be a little bit lower res than to stop the flight. And so what we can do is keep lower res versions of the textures around, even when the high res ones have to go away to free up VRAM. And that way, when you need the texture, we can show you the low res one first and bring in the high res one quickly, as opposed to stopping your flight. So the example I use is you're leaving Las Vegas, you're flying away, and all those hotels, the Bellagio, all these beautiful custom hotels that Cristiano did, you're not looking at them anymore, right? They're behind you. At that point, we might want to free up the VRAM from all of those custom textures for something else that you care more about, right? So in the OpenGL world, they come off your graphics card so you could do other things. And if you said, oh my God, I forgot my luggage, you fly a U-turn, you turn around and we say, okay, time to draw the Bellagio. And OpenGL goes, what now? Oh God, hang on. It's over there in VRAM. It goes, it gets the textures, and it's as slow as it sounds. And you might see ka-chunk, ka-chunk, ka-chunk. You'll see a couple frames of stutter, and all of a sudden, my FIPS are back when the graphics card gets its act together. What we can do is we can keep a very low quality version of the Bellagio around and then res it up. And so that flight's going to be smooth, and maybe for half a second, the Bellagio is a little blurry, and then it comes up. But here's the thing. Maybe you made it 20 miles away from Bellagio before you realized you forgot your luggage, right? And in that case, that blurry Bellagio, it's not going to matter. It's 20 miles away. It's just a tiny, tiny little building. With OpenGL, if our Bellagio texture is high res, it had to go get the whole thing to do anything. And since we know how we use textures, we can say, the low res proxy, that's pretty good. That's going to be a better way for this to happen than what we're doing before. And that's the kind of control over the environment that we get with Vulkan that we never had with OpenGL. The benefit of OpenGL is it does so much stuff for us. And back in the day, that was really important. When X-Plane was just Austin, and then when it was just Austin and me, not having to write all this code was a huge win for us. It allowed a two-person team to get a lot done. But, at this point, flight sims have gotten really fancy and really complex and really good. And having the control to get exactly what we want is exactly what we need.
So I find that really kind of interesting, and just from your explanation, you can almost kind of vision how this will improve kind of performance for people. And you talk a lot about like the Bellagio and obviously work that you've done at Laminar. So how does this impact kind of the third parties and their add-ons and their airports and their scenery? Are they going to require big changes to the way they develop or their current products so that it can use the Vulkan technology effectively? Or is there been a lot of work behind the scenes from your end to make that a very smooth and easy transaction for them?
We've done a bunch of things to try to make it easy to transparent to don't do anything for add-ons, but it really depends a lot on the category of add-ons. So, for example, if you have a scenery pack, the scenery pack is just going to work. There's nothing you have to do. Making your scenery work is our problem. So if you're modeling, if you're doing 3D textures, if anything that doesn't involve code, it's pretty much just going to work and you don't need to do anything. We have a bunch of third-party developers in our private beta program right now, and that's been really great because they can try their add-on and say, hey, I'm seeing some weird stuff with my add-on, and then it's our problem to go figure out what we did wrong with compatibility. We have OpenGL compatibility for plugins for 2D drawing. And that's really, really important for the airplanes because a lot of the third-party airplanes have custom panels where, for example, the EFIS display is being drawn using code the developer wrote, and that lets them get really, really accurate flight displays and things like that. And we don't want to make them rewrite that code. That's a big investment. It's a lot of work. It would not be easy to rewrite. So we run their plugin in a small mini OpenGL environment, and then we slurp up the results when they're done. So most airplanes should just work unmodified. We have seen some incidences where a third-party add-on should work, but because they're doing old coding techniques that haven't been updated in a while, they don't. And what they need to do is modernize, but the facilities for that are already there. And so far, when we found that, the third-party developers have been very willing to just update their code to the latest tech. So I think you may see some add-on developers have to modernize things where they haven't had time to get up to date. And hopefully that will not be a hard transition for them. I think you'll see a lot of stuff just work. We've got a pretty long list of bugs that we need to work out to try to get that compatibility as smoothly as possible. The other thing to note is that you don't have to use Vulkan. There's a checkbox in the UI now that says use Vulkan or Metal Driver, depending on what OS you're on, and you can just turn it off. And we're really going for as close to perfect compatibility as we can get with OpenGL, because one thing we don't want to do is have anyone wake up and, hey, I have all these add-ons, I paid $1,000 for them, I just want to fly, I got this update, and now nothing works. Oh crap! Like that's a bad day, and that's not fair to anyone. So we're really trying to make sure that if you do not turn Vulkan on, that we haven't accidentally changed the rules of OpenGL in some way. So we're aiming for really, really, really careful compatibility there. The one category that's not compatible is there is not a way to draw in 3D in Vulkan. We don't have an API for that. And unfortunately, that affects the weather add-ons. A lot of the times they're drawing their own clouds in 3D. And we're aiming for OpenGL compatibility that's complete and just works for them, but we do not have Vulkan compatibility for them.
So I can imagine that's... So again, I am not technical. So is there still going to be, if I had that Vulkan driver ticked in the menu and I still want to use my weather add-ons, is that possible? Or is it going to be, a long time coming before I can start to see those 3D clouds and stuff?
I'm afraid it's going to be a long time coming. And this is basically the one sad point in the compatibility story, because, with the airplanes and the scenery, we think it's going to be really pretty straightforward, and we've done a lot of work to make it that way. With
Sure.
the weather add-ons, it's not. And this is the problem we have. So first of all, the add-ons just don't work in Vulkan, right? We have to create some way for them to talk to Vulkan. This is not something that exists. This is something that we have to develop out of whole cloth. And the problem we have, this gets into all of our Vulkan effort is about how we draw the sim. Do we render fast? It's not at all about what we draw. And every question, will Vulkan make the clouds look better? Will Vulkan make the nightlights brighter? Will Vulkan make the sky more blue? The answer to every one of them is no, sadly, because the point of Vulkan is just to go faster and smoother. It's the same thing, only better. The next step after Vulkan is to change the what, to change what kinds of things we draw. And the very next thing on my to-do list, and I've actually had some time to start poking at this stuff, but as Vulkan gets out into the world, I'm starting to get more time, is to really go back and examine everything about weather, about clouds, about lighting, about all that stuff. Because we haven't had time to update that code in a while, and we know it could look much, much better. And with Vulkan, we've had to focus on just drawing and drawing fast. And once we have Vulkan, then we can say, okay, is the V10 clouds really the best way to do clouds? God, no, of course not. Of course not. That technology, when we did the V10 clouds almost 9 years ago, we looked at them and we said, we're doing these particle billboards. This is going to be the last particle billboard engine we ever write. This is not the greatest way to do it. We can already see that voxel clouds are a better idea. When we wrote the code in V10, we couldn't do voxel clouds. People didn't have the hardware for it. Most of our users wouldn't even be able to run them at all. But we knew that something much better was coming. And once we get Vulkan done, we can start doing this in earnest. But the side effect of this is that if we try to create a 3D API for people to get into our 3D drawing, it's going to be immediately obsolete, because the very first thing we have to do once we get Vulkan shipped is start reworking this entire 3D pipeline, which will change all the rules of what it is to draw in 3D. And one of the things that we try to do for our third parties is not upend what they're doing continuously, because these guys sink a ton of time into making their 3D add-ons. And there's kind of no worse news than I spent a ton of time on my 3D add-on, and then Laminar did an update, and now everything's broken. So if, when we have 3D drawing in a modern Vulkan engine, we need to make sure it's happening in a way that we can sustain for years and not have be broken every 3 months. So I think our order of operation has to be get Vulkan working so that we have a strong foundation and fast performance, rework our lighting pipeline and our clouds and our weather and our environment and really get something next generational. And then we can say, okay, how do people interact with this? How do they extend it? How do we make an SDK for this? Because that will be something that we can really, have as a solid foundation for years to come. But that's a process that's just starting for us, which is why it's too soon to expose stuff.
Right. Okay. So I'm just going to ask for, I think some people may be listening. So in terms of kind of default weather already in X-Plane 11 and the way that weather is rendered, will that still be compatible with Vulkan, or is that again going to be changed now with the new drivers?
The weather and all the effects that we have built in version 11 just work in Vulkan and Metal, just like they do in OpenGL. The things they do well, they will keep doing well. The cases where you're frustrated with how they look, I'm afraid you're going to keep being frustrated because they look the same. They should just use less CPU power. So if your CPU is a problem, you'll have higher frame rate. So again, Vulkan is changing how we do what we do. We haven't had to drop any of our existing effects, but we also haven't built new ones, right? That's the next step after we finish Vulkan.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So we've literally spent maybe about 30 minutes now talking about Vulkan. And I guess that's kind of indicative of how much time you guys have been spending on developing this. I think I remember maybe even back in 2017, I think you were first announced that you guys were moving on to this new driver. So and along with many other the community members, have been keeping up with kind of the blog posts and seeing some of the crazy anomalies that have come with obviously moving across from OpenGL to Vulkan. It'd just be kind of cool maybe if you could explain some of the history of development, maybe some of the big challenges you faced in kind of a time where you thought, oh, this is working really well, that you were quite proud of, just to kind of see from your perspective as a developer, less so the technicalities of it all.
It's been a very long journey because we've revisited just about every single part of the rendering engine and asked the question, is this really the best way we could be doing this? Is this what we want to have in the future? Is this going to give people good performance? So, everything has been potentially up for grabs. The process actually goes all the way back to before VR. And native VR support was one of the weird side effects of moving to the Vulkan code, because we started refactoring things and rebuilding. And one of the first things we got was a system that could draw to two eyes at the same time, which is the must-have feature for VR. If VR ran at half the speed of flying because it drew one eye and then the other and it took twice as long, there would just be no way you could have VR. No one has frame rate so fast that they can run at half speed of VR. So once we got two eyes at once, that was a neat milestone to see, because we could already see that some of the new design ideas were just going to be better than the old ones. The scenery shadows started to get better. I just ran the latest Vulkan code on my PC, and I was happy to see that I could run with full shadows, full autogen, and water reflection at a solid 30 FIPS. And that doesn't sound like the highest frame rate number, but I have an i5 4690, which is to say my PC is at least 5 years old. So I'm running on what's become, towards the low end of PC hardware for our users. Almost every user I interact with has a better PC than I do. So seeing, and it was very smooth. This is with an AMD card, and seeing an AMD card hitting a solid 30 FIPS on old hardware has really been great for us because we want to support AMD and NVIDIA. We want to not have to pick a favorite so that people can use whatever hardware they have, so that whichever GPU company happens to have the hot card right now, you can use that card. We just think it's better for everybody if we're not locked into one. And for a very long time, you kind of had to go to NVIDIA to have high frame rate on Windows. And when NVIDIA had a great card, that was good. And when the NVIDIA prices got kind of crazy because of Bitcoin mining, that was not so good. You couldn't get an NVIDIA card for less than $1,000. And I can get this AMD card. It's not fast. Now to see that they both just work great is really fantastic for us because we've been trying so hard to reach that point, and we finally did. So it's been cool to see all this work kind of come to fruition and just see smooth results.
Yeah, I remember like kind of looking at your blog posts and stuff, and I think you had some examples of where the whole scene had been rendered but upside down. And I think you had some crazy like almost cell shading effects where the rendering engine wasn't just quite working. It's been quite an entertaining process, I think, from a kind of a consumer standpoint to see kind of the changes and stuff, and over the years to listen to kind of the technical aspects as well. So
yeah, you get one math operation wrong and all of a sudden everything's sideways or everything's we just had a bug last week where all the plugin windows were upside down. Like everything was perfect, but the window was exactly flipped. And the OK button was at the top of the dialog box. All the text was flipped. These things come and go. It's very picky programming. But sometimes the bugs are so fun to see that we wish we could keep them.
I was just gonna say, like, have you got like an archive of screenshots that maybe one day in the future you can kind of share as like hey, this is the long last process it took to kind of get to where we are today, just for a bit of humor.
I have an archive, but it's never complete enough because sometimes you go, I got to get a picture, and sometimes you're like, I just got to fix the bug, and so you blow through. Right. Austin has us send notes to him once a week on what we're doing so we can keep tabs. And the art guys, they always send these beautiful screenshots of what they're working on. And that stuff will make you drool because that's what's going to ship later. You get to see it early. But I got tired of them all having these great screenshots. So for a while, I would just send a picture of one of my broken bugs every week. And it was like, okay, here's, the whole sim, but everything's purple. And here's the whole sim, but all the shadows have turned magenta. And I would just photobomb it once a week. But sometimes you've just got to fix the bug and move on to the next thing.
I can totally foresee, like, come April 1st, you guys are going to release an update called Upside Down Mode or something like that, and the whole thing's just going to be upside down, and people are going to go crazy.
It's very tricky to use because the mouse clicks are not upside down, so you have to figure out roughly where the mirror image point is if you want to close the window.
Wow. Do you know, it reminds me of getting like those power-ups in like Mario Kart and stuff, where you pick up an item and then the controls are just all messed up, and it just causes like chaos and stuff. Imagine that on like online networks and multiplayer and stuff. That would be quite interesting, right?
just what they want to see on Patson.
Yeah, exactly. And this is why you haven't controlled, just in case.
Yep.
Cool. So I think Vulkan is from what you've been talking about and what we've seen and stuff, is going to be a huge kind of change for X-Plane moving forward. So I want to we haven't got much time left, but I just want to spend some time talking about a few other kind of important subjects that are kind of out there. And I think the elephant in the room, and will continue to be a bit of a theme, I think, over the next couple of months at the very least, is of course Microsoft Flight Simulator, which is due to come out this year. So I think I remember when this originally was announced, I emailed a bunch of developers, and I was really, really curious to see kind of a response from yourselves at Laminar Research, and I think yourself got back to me. And I think you said you were quite impressed with the way aesthetically it looked, which I think was a common theme when we saw that initial trailer back in June. So it's been several months since then. People have had opportunities to use it. There's been a lot more kind of information divulged from Microsoft. So, what are your thoughts now? And are you guys in kind of a quote unquote competitor mode, or is it more business as usual still for you guys?
I would say it's actually both. So I've been working with Austin for a long time, and I guess I would break down the competitive landscape into maybe three eras. When I started with Austin, FSX was a going concern. We were developing X-Plane while FS 2000 came out, 2002, 2004 FSX. So for almost a decade, we were competing with them. And they were obviously the hugely dominant sim, and we were the little guys out in the margins, kind of taking pot shots at them. But people had a choice of flight sim, and we would try to move the bar when we did a new flight sim in terms of doing things that had never been done before, making the flight sim better, and so would they. And we would sometimes see an update and be like, "Oh my God, look, they've really jumped ahead." And then we had sort of a second era after the Aces shop got closed when there was no FSX, and this was a bit of a different dynamic because we didn't have a strong, direct, immediate competitor with the kind of sort of resources and focus that Microsoft was bringing. But also, people weren't really sure what would happen to flight sim. I remember the very first flight sim conference in Hartford. The question was, does flight simulation have a future? This was before X-Plane 11, when I think people were very concerned about whether X-Plane would ever be usable enough for a general audience. There was no sign of an FS reboot coming out of Microsoft. And, that era, I think, has come to an end. This era where there isn't a strong Microsoft competitor, and we're just trying to make X-Plane as good as possible. And we're getting back into sort of a new phase where both X-Plane and Microsoft Flight Sim are going to be pushing as hard as we can to, push things forward and innovate. And in some ways, this has been a difficult time for my team, just because they're in testing. And therefore, their marketing guys are showing everything they've worked up to for a couple of years, all the stuff they've been sitting on, and they really want to show everyone. They get to show it, and my guys, they're it's hard for them, but they're in keep their mouth shut mode. People who are doing things that will ship in X-Plane, they're not showing them because that release isn't here yet. It's still a work in progress, and so it's been hard for us because it's just too soon for us to show what our next iteration is going to be. But there absolutely is going to be one, and there was going to be another, major version of X-Plane, regardless of whether Flight Sim came out. So on one hand, it's business as usual because we weren't going to just do nothing if they didn't come out. On the other hand, it absolutely is competitive mode because we do see what they do, and it does help us think differently about Flight Sim. Instead of saying what can we do relative to the last X-Plane, we now have to say, well, what they've done is possible. What's after that? Can we do what they did and then some more, right? And we also have always looked at other 3D game genres, the driving sims, the shooting games, and the combat games, when we look at ideas for what we can do with graphics. So a lot of what I've seen from the Flight Sim trailers is really well done, but also not super surprising because that level of attention to detail and quality has been in the racing games for quite a while now. So if you're a Forza user, your reaction might not be, "Oh my God, I've never seen this in a sim." Your reaction might be, "Well, it's about time," because they've actually had some of this stuff for quite a while, right? And partly that comes from them doing a very different problem, right? You can't take your Ferrari and fly up to 2,000 feet and see the entire racetrack at once. So we have a different problem to solve, and Microsoft is in the same problem space as we are. But we've been looking at that stuff, and so I think it's going to be a very exciting time for flight simulation because with two companies both trying to push the envelope, everyone's going to be full throttle and afterburners trying to move flight simulation as far forward as we can.
Yeah, and I think that's what's driving a lot of the excitement for me in particular as well. Is kind of we are entering this kind of unique era of flight simulation where we've got huge opportunity now for all these exciting sims, and they look amazing. The hardware is obviously there for kind of the software, and all these different kind of new drivers and all these systems are finally catching up with the hardware as well. And I think we've seen this trend from a variety of different developers, all kind of. I feel like it's a little bit quieter at the minute from kind of the third-party devs. Everyone's a little bit kind of not sure what the future holds, but there have been some that have kind of been a little bit more public in saying, we've evaluated kind of what's going on in the community. We've seen that there's a new sim coming out, and as a result, we're gonna kind of step away from X-Plane development. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why. So I'm just quite curious from kind of your perspective at Laminar is what are you doing to kind of help make development easier for these teams, and what are you trying to do to kind of say to them, no guys, come on, you can still develop for X-Plane, you can still develop for P3D, you can still develop for all these other sims that are out there, to try and kind of encourage them to continue working with your platform.
Right. So there's a couple of aspects to this. First of all, the biggest thing I think we can do to make it easy for them to develop for X-Plane is to just have X-Plane be a very stable platform for third-party development, right? If we give them a way to do something, make sure it keeps working so that their investment is protected. Because if you're a third-party add-on maker and you're a business, it's a business, and we're very aware of that. So we try to look for ways to not make them rework what they've done. That's one of the reasons why having things just work in Vulkan is such a high priority, and why we invested time to make sure we'd have OpenGL compatibility for the panels for airplanes, right? Because if we want them to keep making airplanes for X-Plane, we need to give them time to make new airplanes and not just have to go and rebuild their existing ones, right? That's not the same kind of revenue for them. So, we can try to protect their investment to make sure it's not crazy expensive for them to make stuff for X-Plane. We try to be as open as possible to getting their questions answered. We have a developer relations program. So, they can sign an NDA and actually get into our Slack chat and find us. We try to do an audio Q&A every couple months, and just generally make sure that they can get answers to the questions they have. We try to get new features in if they need a data wrap or some other hook into the sim. We try to get that for them in a timely manner. So, what we can do is try to make their development process easier and more streamlined. The other part is the business process, though. They are running their own business and they've got to make their own decisions. And if they make a business call that they think that, the right way to spend money is not working on X-Plane, we can't tell them how to run their business. So, I have to respect any decision they make, even if it's not the one we want. All we can really do is make the experience as good as possible for them so that they don't have any regrets, and so that their add-ons work really well and look really good. And that's one of the balances we have to strike is how do we keep making X-Plane better? How do we keep modernizing it and making it look better without breaking the add-ons, right? This hasn't really been a conversation with FSX because it spent a decade not changing. So, will my add-on be compatible with FSX in a year? The answer is, of course it will, because nothing's going to change. But we've been going in and moving, to physically based rendering, moving to 64-bit. We've made a number of these transformations already, while we were shipping, while people were making third-party add-ons. So that's something that we have a lot of experience with, and that we need to keep doing when we move to Vulkan is, moving Flight Sim forward, but not leaving the add-on developers behind at the same time. So it's a tricky balance, but we think there is a balance because this is how we've been doing X-Plane for the last decade or so.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes total sense. And I would definitely not say this is a vast majority of developers. I think there's just, like you said, people are evaluating their current business, and for some people, it's X-Plane is a really viable platform, and you've seen the likes of loads of different developers right now kind of really focusing and really bringing their products to the platform. And I think, again, if we think back to Vulkan and the kind of the way that it's going to kind of evolve the sim to be this much more stable, performance-friendly platform, then hopefully that will again encourage more and more people to check out this sim. So my final question before we kind of really wrap things up is, it was quite interesting to see that Vulkan is going to be part of X-Plane 11 as kind of an incremental version number. So I know you spoke a little bit about kind of once Vulkan is out the door, you've got some other focuses such as kind of the lighting, the weather, and the clouds. Are we going to start to see kind of X-Plane 12 news in the future, or are you still very heavily involved in kind of X-Plane 11 development?
Well, there's limits about what I can say about a future version because I don't want Austin to cut off my fingers because it would be hard to fix my bugs if I can't type. We chose to put Vulkan into X-Plane 11, and that was a hard decision because one of the things that we did say is like, is this going to be such a big deal that we need to do a new version, right? Is this something that people are going to have different hardware requirements for, et cetera? And the conclusion I had was that the Vulkan beta would be a complicated, long one with a long tail of users who have strange things happen, right? Older hardware, older drivers, maybe it doesn't run well. And so it seemed like a good candidate to do within the version so that people can keep using the old version of X-Plane, right? And there's a really good safety valve here, which is if the Vulkan version isn't working well, you can turn it off. If the beta is not working well, you can go out of beta. So, it was a tricky decision. In the end, we said, we do this in V11 because it's the right way to ship the feature for our users and give everyone a lot of time to get used to it, without having the chaos of a major version making that process nutty. Because a major version is kind of a circus. It's a really big announcement. We really want it to be done on the first day, and Vulkan doesn't quite fit that. We are starting to think about things after 11. We're starting to think about things after Vulkan. It's too soon for me to announce a major version, but to state sort of the obvious thing, version 11 is not the end of the X-Plane run. We're not giving up. We're already thinking about what the future is. We already have things coded for the next major version of X-Plane. So we're absolutely looking towards what comes next. And it's a hard time for us because it's too soon to announce what comes next. And this is also what's, I think, hard for third-party developers because they see what Flight Sim 2020 is going to be, and they're going, oh, that's going to be huge. And then they look over at us, and we're not ready to show stuff yet. And so I think it's going to be easier for Flight Sim developers to evaluate whether they want to stay with X-Plane and what we have to offer. Once we get further along, we can start showing new tech. And at that point, they can say, oh, yeah, that's going to be pretty good too. That's a feature I'd like to make an add-on for. That's going to make my add-on look really good. And it's hard to have to ask for patience because, Microsoft is out there showing stuff now. But this is the cycle we're in, and we do need to get Vulkan finished and stabilized before we can move on. So, the timing is what it is with these things. You get to control your own release cycles, but you don't get to control the timing of your competitors. And so, we have to live with the situation we have.
Exactly. Cool. So final question, and I don't know what the answer will be. Obviously, you were predicting kind of an end of 2019 for getting a public beta. So what's your new time frame looking like?
I did say, I said at Flight Sim Expo that if we didn't have it out to users by the end of 2019, I get a figure cut off. And so we did seriously consider just going public beta on December 31st. And we said, it's probably better to make something that's, really solid from day one than to just try to avoid changing what we said at FS Expo. I would say we're looking at weeks for the public beta and hopefully not a lot of them. It's not so soon it's going to be days, but it's not going to be months. VRAM management, I would say at this point, is the only issue that's stopping us from sharing this with everybody. And we are making real progress with it. The VRAM management code we have now is light years ahead of what we had in 2019 when we were saying this isn't quite ready yet. But it's also something that's, it's going to take a lot of testing, right? We write this code and we go, oh, we've really got this licked. And then we give it to the third parties and we see what actually happens. Because X-Plane is not a closed system. And so we can't actually know what's going to happen on your machine. You can add any combination of add-ons that you want. And X-Plane being wide open is one of the things that makes it great, but it's also one of the things that makes the coding tricky because we can't predict exactly what you're going to do. So it might be a couple weeks as we get the new algorithm going, and then we have to test it a little bit internally and get some bugs out. But I think we're getting close. We're starting to see things that are much better than they used to be.
Excellent. Awesome. Well, I hope Austin doesn't cut off your fingers. Otherwise, we're never going to get Vulkan.
It was only supposed to be one finger, so I suppose with 9 fingers we could still ship the product.
Well, who knows? But honestly, thank you, Ben, for your time today. I feel like I've learned a lot just from listening to you. So hopefully, the people at home as well have kind of picked up on a few cool new tidbits relating to Vulkan. But honestly, thank you so much for your time, and the best of luck, obviously, when it does get released, because it's obviously going to be a huge milestone for you and the team after all these years of development.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me on.
No problem. And to everyone else, thank you so much for listening. And make sure you check out FSElite.net for more information on Explain 11 in the future. Thanks, everyone, and bye for now.